welcome to the House of Mystery. Today we have the Authenticator, my good friend Dalton Mortimer.
Hello and good evening, everyone. It's getting crazier out there, and as usual, when things get crazy, things call me to sort through the bullshit. So,
Yeah,
thanks for sorting, I guess.
yeah, and today we're going to be talking about climate change, Greta Thunberg, and really the cult-like mentality that's been cropping up recently regarding the two. So, I don't know if you guys know, but Greta Thunberg is a 16-year-old Swedish girl who is a climate change activist. She is the daughter of actors, and her grandfather is actually an actor and a director. Recently, she spoke to the UN about climate change, and I actually have her speech here. Uh, she goes on, she says that this is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yeah, you really should. And I don't know why your parents would let you drop out of school, yeah, to speak about a subject that you clearly know very little about.
Because they're the natural answer is because they're the ones that pressured her into it, and because they are extremely politically charged individuals, even marching with Antifa on multiple occasions. They honestly probably see this as their daughter being called to serve a greater good.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of both of her parents and Greta herself wearing an Antifa shirt, so that's definitely something that they're involved with. Um, you know,
Yeah.
Antifa that could be a whole other stream altogether.
That being said, it's very important, I think, that we do not blame Greta for any more than she is directly responsible for, because
No, I mean
she,
I'm not
yeah,
going to try and be mean or insulting. I'm going to criticize some of the things that she says because if we're going to speak to the UN and try and lecture,
yeah,
most of the
that's
world,
a
your word should be able to hold up to
mind-bogglingly,
scrutiny.
yeah, that's a mind-bogglingly grand position of authority you've been placed in to be able to speak at the UN about your pet moral projects. So you're going to be put under the microscope for that.
Yeah,
But but before we get into that though, I just want to say the people pressuring Greta into this are despicable fuckwits because number one, she's a 16-year-old girl, and that alone is kind of skeevy, but also she has some variation of autism or Asperger's syndrome.
yeah, and
And
she also has obsessive compulsive disorder, I believe.
yeah, and that being the case, given that one of the main sort of features of high functioning autism uh, is extreme hyper focused fixations on one or two particular topics, I can't help but think that her ability to hyper focus like that, which is probably only helped by the obsessive compulsive disorder, is being used to basically emotionally abuse her. Because imagine if everyone who you look up to as a 16-year-old with, autism and obsessive compulsive disorder was telling you about this moral ideology whereby basically the entire planet is going to be doomed within your lifetime. I can't imagine a neurotypical 16-year-old taking that very lightly, and I can't imagine what it must be like um for a neuroatypical person who literally cannot help but fixate on things to an unhealthy degree, almost.
Yeah. Well, let's get back into
And of course the emotional simplicity of people on the spectrum tend to be quite a thing as well. But anyway, you were saying, sorry.
yeah, let's get back into her speech. She says, "For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you are doing enough when politics and social solutions needed are still nowhere in sight?" Now, let's get on that. She says, "For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear." I've got some climate change predictions. Uh, I, I've been going back since like the 70s. and it's pretty clear that the science has been wrong time and time and time again.
Okay, let's actually talk about the science for a hot minute here. Every time um the climate change predictions come about, they are almost invariably the most extreme and fanatical and wide-reaching as they could possibly be. And rather than those predictions usually being the ones to come to pass, it's actually the most minor and most conservative estimates that tend to be the ones that come to fruition. Because the climate is changing. I don't think there's any
Yeah,
way you can dispute that, and I don't even necessarily think you can ignore human beings as a variable. Now, I am very specific when I say as a variable because I do not think that human intervention or human meddling is the primary variable for climate change.
yes. Well,
Um,
human beings have definitely had an effect, but the climate's been changing ever since the Earth has existed. I
yeah,
mean, they have done studies where they dig through layers of Earth and find vegetation that existed that could not sustain itself at the current location in its current climate.
yeah. And that's the other thing. I think it's important to remember that the history of human beings relative to the overall history of the Earth is a microsecond in comparison. The climate has only existed in a form um, that favors highly intelligent bipedal life forms like us for just slightly longer than we've existed as a species. So, in actuality, the climate that favors human, you know, evolving and thriving is probably the outlier in the overall climate of the planet Earth. And that is a scary and frustrating thing, and that's fair. But again, from what we've seen, only the most minor of the predictions come to pass, and usually, and I've looked into this recently, and it's kind of funny. Usually, not only is it only the minorest differences that come to pass, but it's actually the most minor predictions of the previous set of predictions that come to pass. I.e., whenever you have a new set of climate change predictions, you can almost invariably look at the previous set of predictions, most conservative estimates, to see what the climate is actually going to do in general. Um,
Yes, but that may be the case. That is the case. But, you know, you don't get up to talk to the UN when you have only the most mildest conservatives of predictions. Like, you
yeah,
get up to talk in front of the UN when you claim the world is going to end in 12 years, is what Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez said. And 8 years is what Greta Thunberg claimed in one interview. But some of the previous predictions of doom and gloom, going back all the way to 1967, claimed that we would die of famine by 1975.
and it's quite a significant time longer than 1875, or we wouldn't be sitting here on the internet having this conversation. Um, and I think it's worth pointing out that there's always going to be a level of uncertainty when dealing with complex systems, and there are very few complex systems that are relevant to human beings um, more complex than the Earth's climate. I mean, think about it. Think about it this way: we have not substantively changed much in the way that we predict the weather from a century ago to now. The only thing we've done is get incrementally more efficient at our ability to predict the weather, but there are still plenty of times meteorologists straight up get the weather predictions wrong. Now, why is this important? It's important because let's say the predictions are wrong or in error only 5% of the time. And that's fine if you're only dealing with a one variable system, but again, the climate is a multivariable system. And if every single variable you have is off by 5%, and you factor each of those mistaken variables into an equation, then you're going to get way more than 5% of error because each individual variable carries a 5% possibility of error. And that's even being conservative and saying it's a 5% possibility of error. Now you take that and you point out that we have a difficult time predicting a year's worth of weather events, let alone many centuries worth of weather data, which we've only just now started collecting back in the 70s when this became an issue in the first place. So yeah, I don't trust the predictive models of the climate purely from a mathematical standpoint, let alone the actual empirical data, which appears to suggest that we've gotten it significantly wrong every cycle since we started bothering with this shit.
Yeah, let's examine how wrong we've gotten it. 1970, Ice Age by the year 2000. See, 1970, America subject to water rationing by 1974, and food rationing by 1980.
Excuse me while I literally go and get my bottle of water.
1971, new ice age is coming. 1972, new ice age by 2070. Okay, that has not happened yet. But but that's a ridiculous amount of time to make a prediction.
And okay, let's also be fair. Yes, science is, at least in the realm of empiricism, the best model we have, or the best set of models we have found to predict shit.
Yeah, but the understanding of science for humanity has changed, over the centuries. There's a lot of things that people used to be, absolutely certain about, and now new science has come out and determined that was wrong. So for them to say that this is, an absolute thing, I mean, they're basically claiming a level of omniscience on par with God.
And let's also be perfectly clear that human bias is relevant here. And I say that human bias is relevant here simply because when you give something moral or conceptual authority, like people do when they are given with a political ideology of any particular description, that will inevitably and inexorably bias any data you collect as a result of that bias. It's just an inevitable fact of, basic data collection shit. And they have, especially recently, started pulling so much moral authority out of the thin air of this ideology that there is absolutely no way this can't be subject to emotional hysteria. It's simply incalculably improbable that this would not get out of hand with all of the moral impact they're placing onto it.
I mean, her entire speech is moral hysteria.
And let's also be clear, the concept of global warming or climate change was created by people who, a decade before they started doing climate research, were Terence McKenna style hippies. So they were already prone to sort of a one world, nature is wonderful lens that they have now followed through into the sciences. And we've been kind of reaping the consequences of that for the last 50 years. Because a bunch of what basically amount to secular Gaia worshippers got into the sciences and then immediately started going, oh, look, we're fucking with nature just like I always said we were. We should stop that. Otherwise, the world is going to end. And to be perfectly clear, I have no problem with green energy. I think it is far more efficient than fossil fuels, and I think we would be stupid not to take advantage of it. It is the next frontier of human technology, and I think we do need to get our heads out of our asses and get the fuck off of fossil fuels, because fossil fuels were always destructive and inefficient.
So I always thought that fossil fuels were a temporary stopgap to get humanity to the industrial revolution, and eventually get us to a point where we wouldn't need them anymore. And new technologies are starting to emerge, but we're just not quite there yet where we can get away from them completely.
Yeah, it's mostly an efficiency issue, and the funny thing is, this has been a problem pretty much since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Anyone who knows their steampunk very well knows that fossil fuels isn't even the most efficient power mechanism we discovered back at the start of the Industrial Revolution. It just was impracticable to rely on steam for everything. So we went with a energy source which is a higher yield but much lower efficiency and much more corrosive, which is fossil fuel. Now, is it similar to say that in a similar way wind is cleaner and nuclear is cleaner and what have you, but it's simply impractical? Not necessarily. I think a lot could be done if we just got the fuck over anti-nuclear hysteria. Like we were discussing before we came on, most of the anti-nuclear hysteria that happens is the result of two incidents. That one time that a tsunami in Japan utterly fucked over a Japanese nuclear reactor, and that time basically human inefficiency and ideological woo of the communist variety, oddly enough, broke Chernobyl, more or less. And barring those two extreme examples that have plenty of mitigating variables to them, nuclear is a remarkably safe form of energy, especially when you consider how dangerous the raw materials of nuclear power actually are, given that we're fucking with the basic building blocks of reality here. In fact, it's funny that nuclear power is significantly safer than materials that you would think would be a lot than utilizing materials that you would think would be a lot more safe, like geothermal or of course fossil fuels. But because those two big disasters happened, there's a appeal to fear and hysteria that again gets charged with a lot of emotional and authoritative energy, and so everyone goes, no, you can't possibly look into nuclear. It's exactly like people saying we can't look into genetic engineering because the Nazis engaged in eugenics. That's essentially tantamount to what's happened with the bias against nuclear energy.
Yeah. Hey, the thing is, America has been using nuclear power for decades, and the only two examples they could really come up with come from two foreign countries. So clearly, America has the right regulations and the right materials and the right, construction to make nuclear power viable. Yeah. And if you don't rely on nuclear power, then it's going to take a lot longer to get away from fossil fuels because, wind power, it's not as efficient as nuclear power is. I read somewhere that in Germany they tried to go big on wind energy, and they're starting to run out of land to build wind farms.
Yeah, and there's a very good reason for that, because the raw materials to energy output ratio of wind power is completely FUBAR. And as much as I would prefer we use solar, we simply haven't put enough resources into the study of how to construct solar panels properly to innovate them to the point where they're practicable either. Now, again, I would support something analogous to a Green New Deal, not the one that was proposed by AOC and her ilk recently, an actual New Deal that's green energy oriented. which is what I originally signed up for. But barring some kind of government grant or some rich eccentric motherfucker putting a lot of money into like a foundation of some type to make things like solar panels and wind turbines more efficient, it's going to be nuclear for the foreseeable future. And I think we need to get the fuck over the hysteria. Yes, we are fiddling with the building blocks of reality, but we've been fiddling with the building blocks of reality pretty much since science was ever a thing, and significantly before, I would imagine.
Do you want to examine the Green New Deal for a moment?
Oh God, I've never seen a good idea taken to such a wrong place.
The Green New Deal. I read it over personally, and a lot of the changes, I don't think any of them would actually even work. Some of the technologies that would be required to do them doesn't exist yet. It would all require a massive amount of power to be given to the government and essentially a council to oversee America's energy efficiency.
Yeah, and okay, let's actually talk about that for a second, because like I often say, I'm the token leftist in our circles, and I actually supported when it was in the conceptual stages the idea of a Green New Deal, because I actually know shit about the original New Deal, which had mostly to do with manufacturing and infrastructure. And manufacturing and infrastructure is where our country is completely foobar at the moment. When AOC and her ilk got involved, and I actually used to support the movement that unfortunately got them elected, which was the Justice Democrats, and I still in many ways do, though I don't support them. When they got a hold of that basic concept, they basically put a green skin over government contingencies for essentially what amounts to full acquisition of the means of production. And rather than actually marshaling her ambitions a little bit and starting out with something more sensible, Miss AOC went full tilt loco into straight up democratic socialism, which is distinct from the kind of social democracy that I myself and Bernie Sanders and the like support. But she went full democratic socialism, and as a result, the basic concept of a Green New Deal is now dead, because she decided to take a sensible concept, and I will maintain till my dying day that that was a sensible concept, and she decided to frame a socialist takeover of the government through that, and now basically anyone who ever postulates another version of the Green New Deal, a more sensible version of the Green New Deal, a more New Deal oriented version of the Green New Deal, will be laughed out of Congress before it is even said, because she couldn't understand that you don't go full tilt with your most extreme policy or your most extreme talking point when you've essentially first gotten into Congress and are first able to propose a policy. Bernie Sanders has been doing what he's been doing for 50 plus years in Congress, and he's still only made what essentially amount to minor substantive changes. She goes in there and immediately goes significantly further to the left than even her original supporters would support, and I know because I was one.
I argued before the stream that my personal theory is that a lot of the climate change hoopla surrounding Greta Thunberg is eventually going to be made more political and essentially be used as a platform with which certain individuals can gain power. I mean, it all of this does to me seem like it could very easily be moved over into the political sphere rather than just the sphere of activists in the streets.
Well,
People. This seems like the beginnings of a platform.
but that's the thing, and this is why global warming hysteria never really gets anywhere, because it is inevitably made political, and this happens every time there is a cycle of popular climate change hysteria. Um, someone someone essentially looks at the problems of climate change or the problems of pollution and then says, this is why we need global communism or something to that effect. And inevitably people go, how did you get from there to there? That's not correlative at all. What the fuck are you saying, person
It,
who said
it
that?
does seem strange that a lot of the people who are pro climate change are anti-border.
Well, okay, the logic, and I use that term as loosely as it can be applied to anything, essentially is that climate change is likely going to hit the third world harder than the first world. Therefore, we need open borders so that the poor, disaffected minorities can flee their countries to first world countries when
I
climate
mean,
change goes on.
I wouldn't be too worried about the third world. I mean, they're extremely resilient people. I mean, many of them have been living in the desert for thousands of years, and they still seem to be doing okay. I mean, not as great economically or developmentally as certain Western countries, but you know,
Oddly,
they don't seem to be in any danger from their environment.
yeah, oddly enough, if we would stop with the fucking Western chauvinist charity bullshit and just leave them to their own devices to actually develop as civilizations for 5 minutes, a lot of them would already be on par with the first world. Like, as an example, if you actually go back to about 1970 and you look at pictures of the Middle East, it's not actually that different from pictures of the Western world that you would find in about the year 1970. Most of the throwbacks to Islamic radicalism and hyper traditionalism and such were the result of the West essentially coming in meddling, because something dictators, but really something oil, and essentially the fundamentalist clerics and imams took the opportunity to say, see, this wouldn't have happened if we had just stuck to our original traditional values. So let's throw everything back to the way the Quran says we should be living, and then the crazy shit that falls out from there. That's one of the reasons I heavily support people like Majid Nawaz and Imam Tuidi, who are essentially trying to be the Martin Luther and Calvin of their religion and lead what essentially amounts to a Protestant reform. Because if the Middle East can be on par with the America of the 70s, back in the 70s, then essentially what needs to happen is they need to have less hysteria and less violence to feed the fundamentalist clerics with, so that they can't push their traditionalist rhetoric anymore. And the only way that's going to happen is if we get the fuck out of the Middle East and leave the Middle East to its own devices for a little bit. Will there be, horrible atrocities committed in the meantime? Sure, but unfortunately, it took the Inquisition and the Black Death to birth the Renaissance. So unfortunately, if you want to stop the backwards bullshit traditionalist thinking of people in Africa and the Middle East, then you've got to leave them to their own devices and let them sort their own shit out. You essentially have to adopt something analogous to the Prime Directive from Star Trek. Leave the culture to their own devices long enough for them to sort their own shit out. And honestly, I think if you do that, you might actually see their cultures not only equaling ours, but probably surpassing ours, because during the time where the Roman Empire fell, it was the Muslim world, or what we would call the Muslim world, that kept most of Rome's like traditional knowledge alive. So it, I don't think it would take much. It would just take us getting the fuck out and leaving them to their own devices for a few decades. But we have to feel like the moral superiors of the planet, so can't do that.
Back to the topic of climate change. Since the advent of Greta Thunberg and Ocasio-Cortez has made climate change a big topic again, there have been a number of protests that have been staged worldwide, and it really does seem that mass hysteria has taken root within these climate change activists because they seem to think that the world is literally going to end within the next decade, and a lot of the behavior seems highly abnormal. Um, let's get one example. Climate change activists host fake blood at UK Treasury from fire engine. That's a bunch of activists got hold of a fire truck and made beet juice so it would look like blood and started spraying down the treasury of the UK. How this is supposed to affect climate change, I have no idea. They hung a banner saying, "Stop funding climate death."
Okay, I will attempt to explain, and again, I use this term as loosely as it can be applied to anything, the logic here. The logic of these people is essentially that everyone else is just comfortably ignorant, or they're so wrapped up in their lives, they're just comfortably ignorant in their positions of power and influence and etc. So we need to do radical shit in order to wake people up. Essentially, is the logic, and again, in Grand Canyon sized air quotes. Um, yeah,
Trust.
essentially every time there is a apocalyptic ideology, um, many times you'll see the proponents of that ideology doing extremely radical, showy, flashy things to attempt to wake people up. Because the notion of people who engage in apocalyptic ideologies is generally that the masses are simply too stupid, too comfortable in their positions, or too ignorant to notice the things that they notice, and that they themselves are actually the enlightened one. Essentially, in an apocalyptic ideology, not only are you going to be offered the red pill and the blue pill, you're going to be force fed the red pill, even as you're willingly reaching for the blue pill in these people's minds.
Well, personally, as a thinking man, I'm more convinced by facts, logic, data, things like that. And all they're really to be doing to me is inconveniencing people, wasting taxpayer money, and really making a nuisance of themselves, and doing major damage to their argument by essentially publicizing the crazier aspects of it than the rational scientific side that might actually convince some people.
Well, but the thing is, when you get these kind of ideologies, you see a preference emerge for two things. You see preference emerge for emotional arguments, and you see a preference emerge for arguments based on authority, i.e., if this is just what's normal, or this is just how it's done, or this is just how things have to be, then it is inherently by default reasonable, no matter how unreasonable we have to be as a result of it. In the essence of it, if you believe what you're doing is saving the planet or saving humans or saving society or how, insert power word moral here, um, it doesn't matter if you have to be unreasonable in the pursuit of saving your proposed benefactors, even if they themselves would not like to be saved, because again, in the minds of apocalyptic cultists, it's always we are the enlightened ones, and it's not that people are evil, it's just they're too ignorant to see, so we have to show them what they're missing by the most extreme measures necessary.
Uh, well, they've definitely got it extreme. Extinction Rebellion protesters dressed as canaries glue themselves to walkie-talkie building entrance in central London blockade. They glued themselves to a building.
Dressed as canaries.
I'm really not sure what to say here.
Yeah, the dressed as canaries thing is the thing that's making me go, what the fuck? Because I know what they're going for. They're going for the old mining practice of sending a canary down into the coal mine to determine whether it's essentially safe for people or not. That's the imagery they're evoking here. It's just I'm not exactly sure how that correlates with gluing yourself to a walkie-talkie building in the middle of London.
Well, I assume they're trying to cause disruption to transit and disruption to public order in order to gain more attention to their message. Um, I just don't see that it's going to. I just don't think it's going to convince anybody.
Yeah, I highly doubt that this is going to convince anyone, and part of the reason why is because when you start this kind of moralistic thinking, where your primary modes of thinking are emotional and authoritative rather than logical, you all ultimately usually miss out on a lot of the ways that your proposed ideology should be logically followed through on. Like, for example, with the feminists, everything is, sacrificed on the altar of equality, but God forbid you point out to them, male children are still circumcised and generally mutilated in the cause of circumcision, but, females would never ever be, and this is not equal. A feminist in our day and age, by right, should be a men's rights advocate by definition, but you say the words men's right and advocate in that order to them, and they will essentially act as though you've summoned the devil.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, I think the nearest example to someone doing what Greta did, or what Greta is doing, is Emma Watson when she proposed he for she. Not since then have I seen someone so woefully inadequate to be at the UN making a giant speech that everyone has lapped up like fucking
I may have.
golden
When did
milk from a sacred cow kind of thing. Yeah.
I might have seen someone more inadequate? When did Sarkeesian and Quinn speak?
Okay, but they were going specifically to complain about things that were allegedly happening to them. Greta and Emma were going for the sake of like highly abstract structural woo. So I I think it's a closer comparison. Also, if you'll notice, it's very much the same sort of aesthetic. Relatively beautiful, young, well-to-do, middle class to wealthy woman comes to talk about moral the moral thrust of the day with no conception of how it applies to anything in practical reality, or is supposed to be dealt with pragmatically, and is just essentially offering an abstract solution to an abstract problem rather than a concrete solution to a concrete problem.
Yeah. It really does bug me that they're complaining about Western countries and the United States and the EU when really the person they should be talking to is China. China produces more CO2 into the atmosphere than any other country on the planet, more than
70%
America and
of
the U.
the pollution from industry comes from China. Only 20% of that comes from America, and and the rest of the 10% comes from all the other countries. So by rights, what they should be encouraging is China to act a little bit more like Europe. Because if China acted a little bit more like Europe, that would reduce that 70% by almost a factor of seven, and we would at least, even for people who genuinely believe in the furthest out predictions of climate change, would at least give ourselves a factor of seven more time to deal with the things
Yeah,
rather than.
I mean, China should change. They're not going to. I mean, they would have to invest in new technologies that they currently don't have. They would have to, change the way that a lot of their major corporations operate. And, for a while, it might cost them a lot of money, and they're not going to take that hit.
Well, also because most of the industry in China is them doing things on the behalf of those other countries. Everything ever purchased in a Western country is more than likely going to have a made in China sticker somewhere upon it, or based on one of the parts within it, or what have you. So like that's the other part of the issue. We actually in the 70s started filtering our manufacturing, and I say we as in basically the entire Western world. We started funneling our manufacture to China, and now we're essentially whining at China for the consequences of that manufacturing. Ultimately, what needs to happen is China needs to act just a little bit more like Japan. And I think if China did act a little bit more like Japan, um, it would be a much more harmonious world. Because can you imagine the advanced intelligence and ingenuity of somewhere like Japan and the resources of somewhere like China? We would be fucking on Mars like within 10 years.
No, the Chinese would be on Mars. I don't know if we would be.
Well, it, it's the same principle though. Like they do things mostly on U.S. behalf, and Japan, of course, uh, was kind of forced into borrowing a lot of its culture from the West. So any benefits to them would probably, or from them would probably be at least exported to us, and then American ingenuity and the ingenuity of the West and the Anglosphere would do with those resources what it always does, and boom, we would be on Mars in about 10 years. But alas, that would require not being the fucking Western savior of the planet, leaving the Middle East to their own devices for 5 minutes, forcing China to behave in an ethical manner, bolstering the kind of behavior that Japan willingly engaged in of their own accord, and also getting our shit together, which honestly might be the hardest part of all this. So as easy as it would be for us to be basically on Mars and probably even colonizing some of Jupiter and Saturn's moons in about 10 or 20 years, if we got everything in the right order in the right time, um, we're not going to, because the people who are left with the power to make these decisions don't know what the fuck they're doing, and instead export all their morality and all of their conviction onto these systemic abstract problems that honestly are spurious at best.
I'm going to actually share my screen for me here because this next climate protest, just to get back to that for a moment, is something that really needs to be seen. I can't do it justice with just my words. So I'm going to share my screen. If StreamYard would work properly.
That would be great, wouldn't it? Sorry if I'm doing more of the talking than I should be. It's just there's a lot that needs to be said about this shit.
Oh man, it's fine. Can you see it?
I cannot know.
It's probably because I got so
We
many tabs
interrupt the
open.
stream to bring you technical difficulty, apparently.
Apparently, I cannot screen share because it's with the something wrong with the browser that I'm using.
Oh, joy. But anyway, what is the thing that you were attempting to share screen for?
It was these protests. The
Extinction Rebellion?
yeah, Extinction Rebellion. I mean, what I
To their
saw.
yeah. To their credit, the Extinction Rebellion are peaceful for the moment. They haven't gone full Antifa yet. Okay, there we go. The screen is
Can you see it?
current. I cannot because my Wi-Fi is shit, but I imagine the people on the stream can see it.
All right. So sorry. Let me just pull this up. Yeah, these guys. Uh, just yeah. When I saw these guys, I immediately started thinking, okay, this has now become some form of cult.
Okay, I may be crazy, but do they look like nuns to anyone else? Because they look like nuns to me, like a red clothed nuns. They almost look like
Yeah,
if you remember if
they
you
seem a
remember
lot
the show
creepier
Legend
than
of the Seeker,
nuns.
they almost look like the Sisters of the Light from that show.
I have not seen that show, but they look way creepier than nuns with the blood red clothing and the white painted faces. But
I don't know. I've seen some weird nuns over the course of my time, but but yeah, they look like they basically look like the modern equivalent of the flaggarts from the Middle Ages, the ones that beat themselves because they thought that the Black Plague was God punishing them.
yeah, but yeah, that's them. And messed up like traffic in England was done entirely in silence, and they genuinely just stood there giving people the creeps. I
Well,
don't know how doing that is going to convince people to help save the planet. I don't know
they
how any
can.
of this is going to. I have no idea how any of this is going to actually achieve their goals.
I will attempt to once again explain from inside the mind of the ideologue. Essentially, at this point in their development as a ideology, as a cult, they still have an optimistic opinion of most people, in the sense that they think that if they just disrupt the status quo enough, people will come to the realization on their own and they won't need too much prodding or convincing. And to be fair, again, since they are still in the creepy, hippie, peaceful portion of their rebellion, not the bash the fash, beat people over the head with bike locks variation yet.
The Antifa stage.
Yeah, the Antifa stage. Um, given that, I think it is admirable of them to be still peaceful, and it's good that they still hold the relatively optimistic view that I imagine they hold. I really shudder to consider the day when someone within their ranks decides people are too stupid, people are never going to get it, so let's just burn everything to the ground because the world is. And this is the thing that's dangerous about apocalyptic ideologies in particular, because if you're convinced the world is going to end anyway, what harm does you destroying some things here and now do? You see this a lot with extremely radical Muslim groups. A lot of them believe that the 12th Imam, or the second coming, essentially, um, is imminent. So they engage in behaviors like jihading, because if the world is going to end anyway, what harm does me, going into a building and blowing myself up do in the long run? And the ends do justify the means, don't they? So, yeah, I'm dreading the day when someone gets too cynical or too black pilled over climate and starts to climate jihad.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard stories where people have actually taken their own lives due to believing that the world is actually going to end because of climate change. And that's really sad because you put this idea out there that everything's doomed. People in power aren't working to fix it, and people who are unfortunately mentally ill may reach the ultimate conclusion that I may as well just take my life now, and that's sad.
Well, I don't. Okay, I don't even necessarily think it needs to be a mentally ill person. It just needs to be a person who is suffering enough. Because if your life absolutely abjectly sucks, and someone comes along telling you everything is terrible, no one's gonna listen to you, and the world's gonna end soon anyway, then you're going to make the entirely rational and of your own accord decision of, I am in pain. I am in a unreasonable amount of pain, more pain than a human being should have to deal with, and someone is telling me the world is ending soon and that the powers that be are nihilistic and indifferent to my pain. So I am going to end my pain. That is a perfectly rational calculation. It's just made based on false information, or in poorly handled ideology in most cases. It's making a correct choice off of wrong data, basically, is what it amounts to.
I mean, I don't know. Even if the world was genuinely going to end, like we have confirmation of a giant meteor heading towards the Earth, I don't think I could ever take my own life.
Well, but you're also not in a ludicrous degree of pain, and so much the better. But to someone who is in a ludicrous degree of pain and essentially is uh of the opinion that to live is to know suffering and nothing else, and then someone comes along and tells them things like the world is going to end soon anyway, again, it becomes not a unreasonable position to hold, to just want to be done with it. Um, and you don't need to necessarily be mentally unstable in order to make that calculation. All you need to do is be in a terrible, terrible situation. And unfortunately, There are a lot of people in terrible, terrible situations in the world in which we currently find ourselves. And though and other people who, despite not being in any kind of terrible situation, need a outlet for their sense of morality and their sense of guilt, so they push ideologies like this, and then those people that are suffering get tempted into doing terrible, terrible things because such is the consequence of ideologies where the world's going to end soon and people being in pain.
I've heard that uh, some people believe in this kind of as a substitute for religion. They say that people need to believe in something, and so without the absence of a religion, because I know a lot of people who believe in climate change are either agnostic or atheists, they kind of adopt this as sort of their pseudo religion.
Okay, I don't I do think that for some people it is the equivalent of a pseudo religion. It's basically, and I made this point when before we came on. It's basically a bunch of atheists and agnostics engaging in a secular form of Gaia worship, and it's extremely funny for me, who does believe in like nature deities and shit, to see a bunch of people who allegedly have no such opinions or convictions engaging in what amounts to worship of the planet. Um, I don't think necessarily that a person needs an ideology or a religion or even necessarily spirituality to find a moral center. I mean, there are entire corpuses of philosophy devoted to morality and ethics, and there are entirely secular individuals, from Hume to Kant to Nietzsche to Foucault, who um, have found perfectly secular, perfectly non abstract reasons to hold moral systems. I do think, though, that people who lack a pre existing ideology are occasionally primed to adopt a corresponding morality to fill the void, because I don't think that a lot of people engage in the kind of moral
Uh,
philosophy that would help them. Um,
1 second, Dalton. I have to go do something real quick. Keep talking so we don't have dead air.
okay. Um, I think the main problem is people people find a spiritual vacuum and they become atheists or agnostics or um, what have you, for whatever reasons they do, and then they don't look into moral philosophy. They don't study Aristotle or Plato or Kant or Hume or John Rawls or the Enlightenment liberals or what have you. And because they don't actually know the practical reasons for adopting immorality sans spirituality, they seek an ideological reason for it, because they don't understand the logic behind their moral convictions. Because on some level, there is no logic behind their moral convictions. There is only emotion and authority behind their moral convictions. And when you see morality in emotional, authoritative terms rather than strictly logical ones, like a philosopher would, you find a system that would justify that emotional, authoritative view of morality rather than looking into personal moral philosophy. And I do think that in many ways the answer to this kind of cultish woo is not religion or spirituality, but individual taking responsibility for your own personal philosophy. You need to and this is why I really deeply hate scientifically minded people who think that there is no use for philosophy, because it either study philosophy and logic on personal, individualistic terms, or seek a collectivist morality, which leads to things like religions and ideologies. Because that is the crux of all of these ideologies. These ideologies only work if you assume that in order for something to be moral, it has to apply to as many people as possible. Whereas something like ethics and morality in philosophy is something you hold on an individualistic level because you yourself, as a rational agent, have examined the rational rather than emotional underpinnings of moral systems. I think if people were more intellectual and took some accountability for their own developing of a personal philosophy, and they understood themselves and the world around them enough to know they needed a moral philosophy and they couldn't just rely on their emotions and their authority, their concepts they give authority to. I think if people engaged in that kind of self-awareness, we wouldn't have these kind of cultish ideologies. But you don't need religion for that. You just need the wherewithal to engage in some rudimentary philosophy and ethics. And maybe I'm biased because I'm of a philosophical bent myself, but I've always been of the opinion that all knowledge begins with self-knowledge, and the first and foremost duty of any rational being is to know yourself, because only through knowing yourself will you have any reference point for how you as a person process the rest of the fucking world. And if you see things in emotional and authoritative terms rather than rational ones, you're going to be susceptible to emotional and authoritative manipulation and collectivized morality rather than individualistic morality.
I've mentioned multiple times on cult-like behaviors and mentalities. So let's go down the list here of cult-like behaviors and see if any of this actually does fit.
It's quite a few, I would imagine, because I'm seeing quite a few hallmarks myself.
Give me a second. My computer's being slow here, like a pain in the ass.
It is refusing to compute. I'm sorry, E, I can't do that.
My computer would end up being the HAL 3000. What is the HAL 9000?
9,000 was the number he was given in the book, in the movie.
Let's see. The group displays excessively zealous and unquestioning commitment to its leader, whether he is alive or dead, regarding his belief system, ideology, and practices as the truth as law. I've definitely encountered some of Greta Thunberg's supporters, defending her beliefs without question and acting like what she says is the gospel truth.
Yeah, but I think it's, again, important to point out that she's not the cult leader. She is
She's just
essentially
an icon. She's not directly leading them. She's
she,
not guiding them, but they do hold her as some sort of figurehead.
she is essentially what amounts to a secular prophet. She is the model by which the cult is run, in the same way Jesus is the anchor for the religion of Christianity and the Buddha is the anchor for the religion of Buddhism. But as with those individuals, most of the actual spreading and the interpretation of the ideology is done by people who are not them, i.e., Jesus's word was left to the leaders of the church, and Buddha's word was left to any number of lamas to interpret, and so on.
Another one. Questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged or even punished. Now, that's definitely occurred whenever somebody has questioned Greta's speech that I've seen. they always get dogpiled by her supporters.
Yeah, and also, lest we forget that the same sort of people that um, preach this sort of climate hysteria also subscribe to social justice ideologies, and very much so. A lot of these same cult-like behaviors occur in modern day intersectional social justice feminism.
Mind altering practices such as meditation, chanting, speaking in tongues, denunciation sessions, and debilitating work routines are used in excess and serve to suppress doubts about the group and its leaders. I have not seen that. I mean, they do chant at some of their protests, but
Um, I think looking at the Extinction Rebellion folks in particular, that there is probably quite a lot of that. I mean, they willingly dressed as canaries and glued themselves to a building. So
that's a fairly good point.
I'm sorry, and maybe I'm generalizing here a little bit, but there needs to be some sort of mind altering going on there, if only to sustain the conviction of a person long enough to do something like that.
This one does not apply. The leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, act, and feel. For example, members must get permission to date, change jobs, marry, or leaders prescribe what types of clothes to wear, where to live, whether or not to have children, how to discipline children, and so forth.
Not
That's definitely something that's not occurring, in
not
my opinion.
among the not among the activists. I do think there are certain segments of academia that do this sort of thing.
I mean, definitely
Like
how to think in academia.
yeah, there was a group not too long ago led by a woman named or buttressed by a woman named Yvette Falarka called By Any Means Necessary, and that was essentially social justice taken to its most cultish.
Uh, yeah, that was more about intersectionality than climate change. But yes, I have heard of By Any Means Necessary, and from what I've read about them, and from people who have left that organization, which according to reports is extremely hard to do, that is absolutely a cult.
Yeah. Um, and and I bring them up again. I know it's not quite the same, but I do think there is a lot of overlap between someone who might engage in By Any Means Necessary and who also might engage in something like the Extinction Rebellion. I think we're essentially looking at two branches of the same sort of root ideology. It's just which aspects of that ideology do you emphasize? Do you emphasize the sort of hippy trippy borderline Gaianism, or do you subscribe more to the moralistic approaches to how human beings organize themselves and so forth?
Yeah,
Or alternatively, are you mostly economics and culture oriented, in which case you're more likely to become a member of like Democratic Socialists of America or the like? But it's all very similar axioms and very similar ideologies at the root of things, and they all come from similar institutions and even to a large extent the same people. So I think it's mostly just different different denominations of the same religion, if you want to use the cultish religious language there.
the group is elitist, claiming a special exalted status for itself, its leaders and members. For example, the leader is considered the Messiah, a special being an avatar of the group, and or the leader is on a
Um,
special mission to save humanity.
and there we are with Greta. Yep, yep. She is a secular saint. So yep.
Well, that's pretty much on the nose. I don't even think we need to question that one.
Nope, nope. Et nomine Greta, et nomine Patris.
Uh, the group has a polarized us versus them mentality, which may cause conflict with the wider society. I definitely believe that because they do seem to oppose the current politicians in power who they believe aren't doing enough, and
Oh,
the
yeah. Also, that was the
capitalists and corporations who are
yeah,
doing the pollution, they believe.
moral shaming was basically 90% of Greta's speech to the UN. So like, yeah, the indignant "how dare yous" kind of make this point for us.
Yeah. I mean, the leader is not accountable to any authorities, unlike, for example, teachers, military commanders, or ministers, priests, monks, and rabbis of mainstream religious denominations. I
Again,
mean,
Greta.
yeah, I mean, when Trump didn't speak to her during that, I think when Trump visited the UN, everybody talked about he snubbed her over how dare he ignore her. Like, he's the president of the United States. She's radical 16-year-old Swedish girl. Why would he bother to meet with her?
Okay, and here's the thing, and this is something I find particularly insidious about this particular group. Um, the fact that she is a child, particularly a child with mental deficiencies, which of course gives her kind of more moral weight in the modern zeitgeist. Um, a lot of times when ideologies resort to using children or are based upon children, the fact that they are children gives them kind of a special buffer or a special position because um, the notion is uh, that children are by default innocent and pure, and that purity should not be questioned or interfered with by the mean, nasty cynicism of adults. Essentially, you could call it the "from the mouths of babes" principle. We're more inclined, I think, on an emotional level at least, to believe something when a children says it, particularly in simple terms, because there's a notion that children are more pure and able to see more clearly in a lot of ways, and in some ways that is true, because children have less of a learned tolerance for the bullshit that adults come up with. But um, when you see children at the head of cults or as saints, there's more of a buffer of not being able to question them because you questioning them is seen as you being too hooked into the system. You're still blue pilled metaphorically to use the terminology from the Matrix.
I don't know, man. I mean, kids lie. Anybody who has had kids or who's been responsible for children know that kids,
Right. No,
don't always tell the
I'm
absolute
not
truth.
disputing that. I'm just saying this is sort of um how the moral game is played in this game of sort of 3D chess. Um, when appealing to people's emotional moral sensibilities, using children gives them a kind of sexual immunity. Yes, I will perfectly submit that children lie all the fucking time and often get quite a lot of enjoyment out of it. I know I did when I was a kid.
Me too.
Um, but um, in terms of in terms of human psychology, which is wired to care for children and to care for people who've been seen as victimized and so on and so forth, the kind of neotness, purity, and weakness that children can affect essentially bypasses a lot of our logical safeguards of human psychology and hits us right in the lizard brain, as it were, right in the moral instincts. When
Yes.
when when a
I mean,
child is seen as hurt, there's something deep within our amygdalas that immediately jumps right to "I will destroy whatever is hurting this child," and that is very useful for ideologies that
well,
want to hit you right in the moral sensibilities and then take root there.
yeah, but you know, sometimes what a child wants, what a child thinks it needs, what a child thinks is good, isn't actually what's best for them. And it's, the responsibility of, people who have the experience, people who have the knowledge, uh, in the situation, adults, to under, to understand that and do what is going to be ultimately the best, even if the child is going to be unhappy temporarily.
Yeah, and
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 I think
and
that's what people need to think about more than just, oh, look at this girl, she's so upset about what's going on with the climate. And actually look at, okay, but is she talking about actually rational and factual? And is it going to be the best solution, going forward?
yeah, but unfortunately, our frontal lobes, for better and in my humble opinion, usually worse, are probably the newest part of our brains. So all of that instinctive, emotional, moral, and authoritative woo that got human beings through those dark years in caves and shit, still often take precedence. And for human beings, the emotional and moral um, baser instincts are the path of least resistance. So you have to, unless you are an individual, and you are an individual rational actor, it's very hard to resist the wisdom of the crowd, as it were. To quote Agent K from Men in Black, a person is smart, people are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it.
Yeah, that is absolutely true in my experience. Uh, Next on the list is the group teaches or implies that its supposedly exalted ends justify whatever means it deems necessary. This may result in members participating in behaviors or activities that would have considered reprehensible or unethical before joining the group. For example, lying to family or friends or collecting money for bogus charities. I mean, they're absolutely doing
Extinction
ridiculous
Rebellion,
things and
right there.
justifying it.
Yeah.
The, the leadership induces feelings of shame and or guilt in order to influence and or control members. Often this is done through peer pressure or subtle forms of persuasion. This is absolutely happening. This is
Again,
essentially the emotional appeal.
yeah, again, 90% of Greta's speech was, "How dare you? You should be ashamed." And because she has the neotness features of a child, and because she has the aggrieved victim points in the human psyche, it bypasses all of our rational safeguards and hits us right in the fucking lizard brain.
Subservience to the leader or group requires members to cut ties with families and friends and radically alter the personal goals and activities they had before joining the group. I don't necessarily know this. I would have to talk to someone who is a member of this Extinction Rebellion in order to determine if that's happened. So I can't really know if really applies or not.
That being said, being as objective as I possibly can while examining this, it really wouldn't surprise me.
I mean, altering personal goals. I mean, yeah, if you genuinely believe the planet's going to be ending, you're probably going to put all your energy into that and not focus on what you were doing before.
You could argue that this is what Greta's parents did to Greta without even realizing they were doing it.
Yeah, I mean, they even said in an interview, we think she should be in school, but we'd rather her be out of school and protesting because that's what's going to make her happy.
Now, I would ask them to what extent that they consider her happiness versus their happiness, because if you objectively look at the situation, assuming that she's not completely bullshitting and completely play acting, most of her speeches involve her crying and being extremely hysterical because she thinks the world is going to end. And hell, I, as a 24-year-old, would be quite perturbed if I genuinely assumed that the world was going to end and there was nothing I could do. I can't imagine, again, what it must be like for a 16-year-old girl who, for all intents and purposes, is very intelligent, but is also susceptible to obsessive compulsive obsessions, and also the mental fixations and simplistic emotional language that the internal emotional language of someone on the spectrum. So yeah, I can't imagine what she must be going through, because if the one thing that her conditions are allowed to fixate on is, oh my god, the world is ending, I would be fucking emotional too. And again, I'm speaking as a fairly, well, I shouldn't say typical, but speaking as a fairly well-adjusted human being, I can't imagine what it must be doing to this poor, young, very much not particularly well-adjusted girl, who honestly seems like, if this wasn't indoctrinated into her, she would be an extremely optimistic, extremely positive person. So I can't imagine what
Yeah,
this
I
must be
mean,
doing to her.
just think about it. If you actually believe the world was gonna be ending, like the level of pressure that would put on you would be absolutely soul crushing.
Especially at the age of 16, with the various handicaps that she has, and the dysfunctions that she has.
Yeah, and if you're, especially if you have obsessive compulsive and your mind would not allow you to think about anything else. I mean, just those. I wouldn't wish those stress levels on my worst enemies.
Yeah, I've dealt with some pretty severe anxiety. In fact, once uh, my heart rate got so bad because of anxiety that my heart literally almost exploded. Um,
That happened to my aunt
but
once.
but I can't imagine the kind of anxieties that she had, because I know enough about obsessive compulsive thinking, and also um, spect disorders on the spectrum, to know that she would be fixating on this on a level that you or I couldn't even fathom, in terms of how much she'd be focused on this. I had a roommate in college for about an entire semester, had severe Asperger's syndrome, and he would fixate on things ridiculously, and um his emotional sort of repertoire, his expansive emotional reactions was very both intense and very simplistic. And I love the guy to death, but he got on nerves quite often of a lot of people. So I can imagine taking this girl at the age of 16 and making her fixate on this in particular. Have If she has anything like my old college roommate had, she is honestly in an imposed hell that, honestly, if she ever makes it out of this, and she manages to break the conditioning, to paraphrase Alex Jones, she should sue her parents for reckless endangerment and child abuse, because this is psychologically abusive, even if you did it to a normal child and you're doing it to a relatively high functioning autistic child. That's just, I this is genuinely pissing me off. The idea of how genuinely abused this young girl is, for the sake of nothing but this abstract woo woo ideology. I just, ugh, rage.
Let's go on
And
to
that,
the.
by the way, is how you actually consider the victimhood of a child, for anyone that's curious. Because trying to make her the fucking messiah is not how you alleviate a young girl's worries. That is how you exponentially exacerbate the problem. Ugh.
Now, on to the next check. The group is preoccupied with bringing in new members. I mean, it certainly try to convince as many people as they can that the world is going to end. And there certainly have been a lot of protests, so I would say that's a yes.
Yeah, that's the whole point of a lot of their activism, is to wake people up, quote unquote. So yeah,
The group is preoccupied with making money. I mean, I haven't seen any people trying to collect money, but I can only imagine that the fire truck that they used to host the UK Treasury building could not have been cheap.
Well, it's always kind of funny that these kind of abstract, far-reaching sociological ideologies are always adopted by people in the middle class and upper middle class and even into the wealthy, because the poor and the working class and so forth are more concerned with practical considerations and therefore don't adopt large scale sociological woo ideologies nearly as much as upper class people. Also, it's important to remember that a large part of the platform of social justice and a large part of the platform of climate change activism appear to be guilt, because the reason why climate change activists focus so heavily on the Western world is because they consider ravaging of nature to be part of what their society is built on. So instead of stopping engaging in the things that they engage in because they've never known a life without those things, they essentially exercise their guilt by foregoing or attempting to forego their position of privilege, i.e., a champagne socialist feels a lot less guilty about being wealthy if he uses his wealth um, to advocate quote unquote for the working class. And a climate change activist feels a lot less guilty about their conspicuous consumption of so many resources and so much that's made in the third world and so forth if they use that position to advocate for the stopping of uh, that conspicuous consumption.
Mhm. Complaining how capitalism is killing the world while tweeting on their iPhones.
Well, again, I think it's more because they see things in an emotional and authoritative rather than logical framework. They don't consider the logical outcomes of their beliefs. They only consider the emotional outcomes of their beliefs, i.e., what they can tie an emotional connection to. Um, so saying something like that to them would be would be tantamount to um, trying to explain to Marie Antoinette why uh, telling the peasants to eat cake isn't going to help the starvation issue, um, because she's registered it on an emotional level and an authoritative level rather than a logical one, and so on. Because they're so guilty about being wealthy, it doesn't matter to them that they have to use their tools of wealth, like their iPhone, to advocate for an end to capitalism or advocate for an end to environmental colonialism, which is something I've heard it called, which is just, God, why?
If these people actually acted the way they talk, they would have to give up so much that they would be miserable because
And then,
they're so used to the luxuries that they have that giving them up would. I don't think anyone would know how to live.
well, that's why champagne socialists of this variety almost never actually endear themselves to the working class, because to to them their position of privilege is essentially just the default to a lot of them anyway. You essentially have two modes in these kind of activists. You have the mode that knows how privileged they are and are therefore guilty and try to assuage that guilt by being as outspoken as possible. And then you have um, the half of them that don't realize how privileged they are and just see this as an intellectual exercise, and therefore they essentially don't realize they're making poor people's lives worse, because to them every human is entitled to exactly the amount of privilege that they are, because they don't see their privilege, they just see their life as the default, and therefore when they see anyone below their default they feel guilt and pity rather than any kind of practical, rational understanding. That's how they can see poor people as victims rather than agents in their own right.
Yeah,
That's that's where the purse
that's
puppy impulse comes from, to borrow a
that's
phrase
also how
from.
they keep using the phrase punching down when they talk about comedians and people like making a joke about like say the LGBT movement, and like Dave Chappelle's new special, people are saying, "Oh, Dave's punching down." But the thing is, you can only punch down if you believe that you are above somebody, and I don't think, and Dave Chappelle doesn't actually believe that he's above people, which is why he makes jokes about everybody.
No, but these people see things entirely in terms of the abstract, in terms of culture, in terms of ideas, in terms of systems, rather than individual components or practical elements. Because in their mind, everything that's practical is just an illusion, a social construct. So essentially, when you complain about not having enough money, or your street being lined with potholes and things, they would essentially look at that as you being short-sighted and naive because you're focused on such a small thing when there are these big abstract systems that need to be dealt with. They need to reshape culture in its entirety, because then um, these potholes won't exist because they won't matter, essentially. That's how this ideology works. When you come to them with practical information, they see that as you being short-sighted and naive rather than you being practical.
Let's see. Members are expected to devote an inordinate amount of time to the group and group-related activities. I mean,
Well, these people in Extinction Rebellion are foregoing their jobs to engage in these protests for basically entire days. So I would imagine that
and I
counts.
also imagine that they take a lot of time to organize and plan.
Yes. So check.
Yeah. Members are encouraged or required to live and or socialize only with other group members. I don't know about that. Yeah, they probably do socialize a lot with people within their own group, but I don't know that they do it exclusively.
Yeah, that one's yet another. You would have to actually go and look at like the statistics to see how m- how many how many non-Extinction Rebellion friends do members of Extinction Rebellion have, and how often do they actually socialize with those people, rather than just sort of passively knowing them.
I mean, however, when you think about it, the kind of people who would buy into something like this are the kind of people who would lose friends over it.
Yeah, I mean, Anglin told the story once that a lifelong friend of his stopped being his friend because he was conservative, which, even as a Bernie supporting, you know, left leaning liberal, I can never even imagine doing such a thing. So you
Yeah,
have to be a special kind of devoted to do something like that.
I mean, you just gotta think: is politics more important than your friends? I
And
mean,
and
some
and
people it
more
is.
more
It's
more more importantly, do your friends not have any valid points? Because that appears to be the line by which these people disassociate with their former friends, because you become so convinced that your um, pet ideology is the only proper way to deal with things, and so everyone else is either stupid, ignorant, or actively malicious. So that's why they so often disassociate, because they think either these people are so stupid, these people are so misinformed and they won't listen, or these people are actively part of the problem. That's their logic.
see, most loyal members, the quote unquote true believers, feel there can be no life outside the context of the group. They believe there is no other way to be, and often fear reprisal to themselves or others if they leave or even consider leaving the group.
Yeah,
I absolutely believe this to be true because
as
they're
I just
trying to save the world, and if you
yeah,
walk away from that, it's like you're abandoning the planet to destruction.
yeah,
So they would absolutely face reprisal, and these people would absolutely fear reprisal.
yeah, as I just explained, the main reason why these people disassociate is because they think everyone is either ignorant, stupid, or actively malicious. So yeah, next.
That is actually the end of the list. So yeah, we've gone through this, and they check the vast majority, if not all, of these boxes.
Yeah, and the only ones we can't check for them are the ones we would have to be in the group itself to know. And yeah, no thank you. Not today. Not a worthwhile social experiment in my opinion.
So I think we can say to some degree of certainty that this is a cult, and
Well, at the very least,
it
it has all of the makings of a cult and is about to be a cult sooner or later. Almost,
yeah,
almost, certainly.
I definitely hope that this does not get more out of hand than it already's gotten. I mean, they're already beginning to disrupt public order. The last thing that this needs to do is become more radical and more violent. I mean, we mentioned Antifa before. I mean, Antifa has taken over entire portions of the city of Portland. I mean, that's mostly because the mayor and police have allowed this to occur. You know, they are violent. They've assaulted numerous people. They have even like redirected traffic while the cops were still there, and the cops did absolutely nothing. So, if these people
Yeah,
start to
yeah.
get more radical and more violent, I genuinely worry about what's going to happen.
Well, I'm more worried about the crossover because I can't imagine that the average member of Antifa wouldn't agree with Extinction Rebellion. So, what's stopping a person who regularly engages in Antifa from joining Extinction Rebellion and then essentially bringing their violent impulses with them and their violent policies with them? And once, and this is the dangerous thing, once they decide that nonviolence is no longer as effective as they need it to be, and someone proposes more aggressive means, how long is it going to take for people to become convinced of that? Now, there's some buffer because, for the most part, the people in Extinction Rebellion are extremely peace-loving hippies, and again, so much the power to them for it. But
I mean, they seem to be peaceful now, but in Greta's speeches and a lot of the interaction I've had with her supporters, and some of the speeches made by some of the protesters at other events, there definitely seems to be an underlying sense of anger in these
confrontation,
protests.
yeah, they're at least in rhetoric, they are extremely confrontational, and that's why it scares me because again, it only takes one Black Lock member joining Extinction Rebellion and convincing enough people to form a splinter group of Extinction Rebellion that is violent, and they're apocalyptic anyway. And that, again, like I said, the reason why apocalyptic ideologies are more dangerous than almost any other ideology is because if you assume that the world is going to end anyway, it becomes a lot easier to justify really destructive means.
All right. Well, we've been going on for an hour and 39 minutes. I think this is a good place to end the stream. So, Dalton, do you have anything you want to share?
Um, just to anyone that is a member of these ideologies and wants out, uh, you don't need religion or ideology to find morality or ethics. You just need to have enough self awareness to examine yourself and determine what it is you believe, why it is you believe it in logical terms, and develop a logical system of morality based on that. You don't need the collective. You don't need to worry about all of humanity. Any worthwhile logical system you divine for morality is going to be something you can apply to as many people as possible. So you don't need your morality to be inherently collectivist, for fuck's sake. That is my advice to anyone in those groups that might be listening to this. Because if you're sensible enough to be watching this, and anything we've said resonates with you, get the fuck out of those situations and engage in some self-examination. For fuck's sake, the world will be better for it. I am convinced of this.
All right, everybody. This has been Mr. E2099 and Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator. I want to thank all of those who tuned in and all of those who are watching afterwards. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember, life is always better with a little mystery.
Cheers, guys.